Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another San Jose Sharks draft preview, this time of their second rounder, the 33rd overall selection at this year's draft. And I went a bit back and forth on whether or not I would even make a video discussing this one, because in the past I've only actually talked about first rounders for the San Jose Sharks, but then I thought a bit more about it and realized that at some point in the future, hopefully soon, the San Jose Sharks will end up winning a Stanley Cup, and they'll get the last pick at that particular year's draft, barring any sort of major expansions from the NHL occurring before that. That will end up being the 32nd overall pick, and I would make a video discussing the players available at 32nd overall. And the only real tangible difference between 32nd and 33rd pick is the fact that the 32nd is made on day 1 and the 33rd is made on day 2. Otherwise, you're picking from the same pool of players, and you're not really getting any differing levels of expected value from the selection that you actually end up making. So realistically, they're pretty much the same types of things, so why not talk about the 33rd overall pick for the San Jose Sharks? But before we jump into the players who may be available and who I will talk about, there are a few things to bring up. The first of which is something I mentioned in my previous draft preview when it related to the Pittsburgh Penguins pick at 14th overall, which is that the Sharks will likely look to move up in this year's draft to try and pick up one of the high-quality defensemen that are available in the earlier parts of the draft, try and get into that top 10, for instance, and that could carry a relatively hefty price tag for Mike Grier. So it is certainly possible that this 33rd overall pick will actually end up being packaged in a deal with the 14th overall to move up in the draft. So technically, everything that I would be talking about in this video would be completely useless. However, also relating to what I mentioned in my previous review, there is no reason to live in a world of what ifs and say, well, if the Sharks, there's a decent chance that they trade 33rd overall, so why even talk about it? That's not really what we should do here. Instead, we focus on what the Sharks do currently have in their possession. They have the 33rd overall pick, so why not talk about the players who they could pick up? I also want to bring up the differences between the types of players that you are expecting to pick up at 14th overall compared to at 33rd overall. So at 14, you're trying to get a solid NHL player. You might not end up with a star who's going to play on your top line or your top defensive pairing, but you're likely going to get a relatively consistent NHL player. Taking a look at the years between 2010 and 2019's players drafted at 14th overall include Jake DeBrusk, Jaden Schwartz, Joel Farabee, Charlie McAvoy, to use an example of a star who did indeed get drafted at this particular position, but you're hopeful that you're going to get a solid NHL player for yourself. At 33rd overall, your chances are definitely a lot slimmer. For instance, the last impact player to come out of 33rd overall was actually Ivan Barbashev back in 2014, and I use the word impact pretty lightly in this particular situation. So there are certainly no guarantees when it comes to a 33rd overall selection. Really, just generally late in the first round picks have still a decent chance of making to the NHL, but certainly it is a steep drop off from the earlier parts of the first round. And so this makes it so that GMs have a very interesting decision to make with these types of choices, because it is no longer a consensus choice from the scouts in which, everybody agrees that this guy is a top 5, everybody agrees that this guy is a top 10. You get a lot more differentiation between players. Some scouts will have a player at 20th overall, and then some other scouts will have that very same player at 50th overall. There can be a lot of difference in terms of those types of predictions, because these players are you're splitting hairs between a few of them. And so you're mostly going with what your own scouts really feel, which players they have been keeping a specific eye on over the past year, over the past couple of years, whatever the case may be. On top of that, you have a very interesting decision to make with what type of prospect you actually want to pick up, not in terms of position of where they play, centerman, left winger, defenseman, or anything like that, but more so in terms of the type of talent that they actually possess. Because you could go for more of a risky selection, a player who has a lot of raw skill, a lot of raw talent, but there are a lot of holes in their game as well that could potentially make it so that they never actually pan out at the NHL level. A good example of that would actually be Luca Cagnoni, drafted last year by the San Jose Sharks in the 4th round, a player who has a ton of offensive upside as an offensive defenseman, but with the major issue being his size will likely not translate super well at the NHL level unless he manages to adapt to those types of situations. There are certainly defensemen in the NHL currently who have not only found success but are thriving, who are also relatively undersized. Just look at a player like Quinn Hughes with the Vancouver Canucks. But there are also a ton of undersized defensemen who never actually managed to get their break in the NHL. This is a risky type of choice where it has a very good chance of not working out, but if it does work out, you end up getting a massive steal in a particular draft. The other type of player that you can actually go with is someone who's a bit more of a safe option. To use an example again from the San Jose Sharks would be the Sharks' first round pick in 2022 at 27th overall, Philip Bystedt. This was a player who, when Mike Grier selected him, was never expected to be a number one center for the San Jose Sharks. That was completely out of the question the moment he was taken, but was expected to be more so a solid bottom six type of center for the San Jose Sharks at some point in the future, and his development path over the last couple of years seems to be leading in that very same direction. He's finally made the transition from the SHL to the AHL, looking pretty good in that regard, and he could even manage to end up making the NHL as soon as next year, again in a bottom six type of role. These are the types of players who have a pretty good chance of managing to make it to the NHL, but even in doing so, you're not necessarily going to reap massive benefits from it. So you really have to ride that line carefully and decide where you want to take your risks, where you want to play it safe, because both of these are very important to be able to pick up if you want to create a really good NHL team at some point in the future. But let us now jump into the names that are expected to be available around the 33rd selection and who the Sharks may end up looking to pick up. And we start off here with defenseman Cole Hutson, a player who was extremely popular in the comments of my previous video. Cole Hutson is the brother of a previous NHL draft pick, Lane Hutson, of just a couple of years ago when he was taken 62nd overall, so late in the second round, by the Montreal Canadiens. And he shares a lot in common with his brother. He has a ton of offensive upside. At his best, Cole Hutson is a player who could end up becoming not only a top pairing defenseman, but perhaps even a number one guy at the NHL level if everything seems to go well for him. But at the same time, he also has a lot of the aspects of his game in which Lane Hutson, his brother, had issues with as well, which is the reason why he ended up falling to the latter parts of the second round. His defensive game is not particularly impressive, and more importantly, his size as a defenseman is relatively underwhelming. I already talked about Luca Cagnoni and what that could mean for a player like a Quinn Hughes currently, but as I said, it is relatively few and far between the undersized defensemen who manage to find elite success at the NHL level. And so when it comes to Cole Hutson, there is definitely a risk there. Having said that, his brother Lane Hutson has actually continued his development very, very well over the last couple of years, played some great seasons in college with, I believe, Boston University, and actually made the transition to being with the Montreal Canadiens right near the end of this season, played a couple of games with them, and even put up a couple of assists. He could perhaps end up being a full-time defenseman with the Montreal Canadiens as soon as next year. And so the development path of his brother may actually cause a bit of an inflation of the value of Cole Hutson. It is unlikely that he ends up being drafted in the same spot as his brother a couple of years ago, and is likely much more to be a mid to early second round selection, and perhaps even a team in the first round, in particular Montreal themselves, may even take a bit of a flyer on him. However, the odds that he is available at 33rd overall are relatively high, and this is the type of risky pick that the San Jose Sharks could absolutely jump on if they really want to. If you consider the situation where the Sharks do end up successfully moving up in this year's draft and they pick up one of those bigger named defensemen in the earlier parts to go along with players like Mukamba Doolin, Henry Thrun, Jack Thompson in their defensive prospect pool, taking a flyer on a player like Cole Hutson where there's a decent chance that you actually end up with an elite type of talent, that could be a very good choice and is likely why he was such a popular option in the comments of my last video, and certainly someone who I would not be disappointed to see the Sharks grab at 33. Moving on to the next player, we have Henry Muse, finding himself in a similar situation as Cole Hutson, a very offensively gifted type of guy who has very solid top four potential in the NHL at some point in the future, but struggles a bit on the defensive side. The reason why Muse finds himself actually ranked above Cole Hutson in a lot of players' mock drafts, or in a lot of scouts' mock drafts, I should say, is because Muse has a bit of a larger size to him. He is 6 feet tall, which is not necessarily a huge defenseman, but he is able to be more competitive, or at least expected to be more competitive at the NHL level. But in other ways, he does have those same types of issues when it comes defensively. He's also a really unpredictable type of prospects, which makes it so that some scouts have him in like the early 20s of their mock drafts, while others will have him in like the 40s to even perhaps 50s. It's definitely a decent chance that he is available at 33, and if the Sharks want to pick up an offensive defenseman who is perhaps a slightly more higher chance of actually eventually making it to the NHL than a player like Cole Hudson, though with a slightly smaller ceiling as well, Muse could definitely be an option in that situation. And then we have another defensive choice here, Dominik Badinka, coming out of the SHL, a league that the San Jose Sharks certainly haven't been opposed to drafting out of over these last couple of seasons. And while both Muse and Hudson were very high potential offensive types of guy, Badinka is more so of a two-way type of player. Playing in a men's league means he has to adapt more defensively than the a couple of players mentioned before him, because if you're not actually playing relatively solid defensively, you're going to be given like 8 minutes a night, if that, or perhaps even sent down to the second tier league. So he has to be able to adapt in that situation, and he has actually done so very, very well. While he's not relied on for like top minutes and penalty killing minutes in the SHL, he does play a decent amount of ice time and has looked quite good in that role. He is definitely a player who is expected to be late in the first round, early in the second round, pretty much for sure, compared to the much more unpredictable levels of Hudson and Muse. If Badinka is available at 33 and the San Jose Sharks are not willing to necessarily take that risk and take those flyers on a player who is slightly more unpredictable, he could be a really good choice, and he could definitely end up being a second pairing defenseman for a long time, a solid shutdown guy for the San Jose Sharks in the future. Moving past the defensive options for the San Jose Sharks, we have a centerman choice, Cole Baudouin, coming out of the OHL. And you might be thinking, well, do the San Jose Sharks really need a centerman? They've got that 1-2 punch, or they're going to end up with that 1-2 punch of Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith. Where does another centerman fill in there? Well, Baudouin is not necessarily expected to compete for a top 6 role at the NHL level. He's a guy who has a lot of size, is not afraid to use it, solid offensive talent, but seems to project more so as a bottom 6 player, kind of like a Philip Bystedt in a way for the San Jose Sharks. And really, you can never really use enough center. You never have too many, I guess you should say, centermen at the NHL level. Getting a bottom 6 guy obviously is not as important as being able to get your number 1 guy that the Sharks will have with Macklin Celebrini, but that is kind of the major difference between those teams that can bow out in like the first or the second round of the playoffs compared to the teams that actually end up managing to make it very, very far. Just take a look at a team like the Edmonton Oilers, who have those really high-end talented centers of Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl. No other team in the NHL can even compete with that 1-2 centerman punch that they boast. But from a depth perspective, there are some struggles for them. And so if the San Jose Sharks do eventually want to be that Stanley Cup competitor, you're not only going to need those high-end guys, but you also need those solid depth guys, and Cole Baudouin would do a fantastic job at that. Like I said, he has the size, he has some offensive talent that means he could end up translating it to the NHL as well, and would just be a really good selection at 33, expected to be picked around that point. And then we have a winger here on the list, Tanner Howe, a very interesting player for sure. It was a couple of years ago he was actually on the Regina Pats in the WHL with a little prospect known as Connor Bedard, and it felt as though many people believed that Tanner Howe was just riding on the coattails of one of the best prospects to ever pass through the WHL. And so people kept an eye on Howe to see how he would actually, no pun intended there, how he would actually manage to perform without Bedard on as the centerman on his line. And while his point totals dropped slightly, which is no surprise when you're no longer playing with a player of Bedard's caliber, they still stayed pretty high up and gives some hope about what Tanner Howe can actually end up translating when it comes to making it to the NHL over these next few seasons for himself. Now, he is a relatively undersized winger at 5'11", and usually when you're talking about a winger at that particular position, you're thinking of a guy who plays more of a perimeter style of game, who's not really going to get into the dirty areas, has maybe a good shot, or maybe is a good playmaker. And there isn't necessarily much more to say about him, but actually Tanner Howe plays a very, very opposite way to that. Howe is not afraid to get to the dirty areas. He has never seen a battle along the boards that he has not been willing to engage into. He is a type of penalty killer player as well, who could definitely help in that particular area while still having that scoring touch. So he is the type of player who you absolutely would love to draft at a 33rd overall selection, a type of player who could fit into the middle six in the NHL at some point in the future as just a feisty, hard-working, slightly undersized, but not too bad as a winger type of player, and I don't think Mike Grier would hesitate to take him if he is looking for a winger and Tanner Howe is available at that point. Like I said earlier on, however, because there is such a large variance in a lot of these scouts' ideas of which players they would actually want to draft, there's no longer just a best player available, very easy type of selection. It is very possible that if the Sharks do keep their 33rd overall pick, they don't end up taking any one of the 5 players that I have talked about here. There is definitely going to be some differentiation, but this is definitely a list of players who could very well fit into that 33rd overall pick for San Jose and would certainly help furthering their rebuild. Class dismissed.